APIs and general utilizing APIs. So what we'll do is we'll cover this quickly, and then there's associated labs again to follow this up. Again, in previous iterations of this course, what we would do is utilize Python, or excuse me, Postman for most of these exercises, and this has now been ported over to the LearnLab 2.0. So I'll show you what that looks like. But really, so there's a couple ways you can approach this, and I actually have one of the versions that I do is it actually kind of tells the history of REST APIs, and there's kind of a story behind it. But for the what's in this deck, it really is just more of a kind of an introduction to what is an API and how to authenticate to it, and the basic features and functions, and how to make use of the APIs. So we'll put this in here. But again, you're welcome to present this content however you want to, whatever you feel is most relevant for your audience. This is just kind of what we landed on for the source material, but again, it's open to interpretation. I know that there's a lot of experts in this call that have worked with REST APIs for a long time, and if you find a different or a better way to do it, then feel free to. So anyway, so here's the introduction to REST APIs. We start by talking that the API is a way for machines to talk to each other. The GUI is the way for interacting with an application for humans. But anytime that you want to do anything in an automated or orchestrated fashion, you're most likely going to be using the APIs. What is REST? REST is the most recent and probably the most prevalent way that APIs are implemented. It stands for representational state transfer, primarily based on HTTP or TLS, and all the communication is done with the API utilizing standard HTTP methods. What we're commonly seeing, though, is a way for interacting with an application that utilizes these HTTP methods and principles, but allows us to do it in a way that to script various calls together, or to obtain data from the backend application in a way that doesn't require us to open up a GUI, log in, make a query, and then cut and paste that query out of the GUI. So it allows us to simplify the way that we interact with the backend applications. A really simple example, we've got an application that we built. We want to ask the application wants to query some backend services, looking to see if there was any malware that was run on this particular network. So in our case, we've got, and this is essentially one of the threat hunting examples that we do a little bit later in this course, but we query secure endpoint to see which computers we have known to have executed malware. We get that response back. Then we can take that information, query Umbrella to say, based on this particular piece of malware, or we ask ThreatGrid first, or Secure Malware Analytics first, which domains are associated with this particular execution. And then we can ask Umbrella, what it knows about the domains that were reached out to during that execution. And then if we find that those hosts are in fact compromised, we can issue another request to a separate application like Identity Services Engine, and then do a containment or an isolation on that asset. So I'll need to fix the animation on that one. But if you look at it from an API perspective, though, so the APIs sit on the outside and they're not labeled. That slide needs to be fixed. And so our application actually just queries those APIs directly, and then the application itself worries about everything on the back end. So Secure Endpoint has multiple databases and services, so does Identity Services Engine. But from our perspective, we don't care. We don't need to write a specific SQL query in order to access the information that Secure Endpoint knows about, or we don't need to know the specific specifications as to how Identity Services Engine isolates using ANC. It has a service behind that, but if we know how to make the appropriate call to Identity Services Engine, it will take care of all of the heavy lifting and the orchestration on the back end. So that's one of the benefits of utilizing APIs, is that it hides that abstraction from the users. So as long as we have an API guide and we understand what is expected when we're making a call, we don't have to worry about all of the complexity behind the scenes. We don't have to know what the application is written in. We don't have to know what the database that the data is stored in looks like. We don't have to make a specific SQL or NoSQL call to query that particular data. And again, if we're utilizing the functions of an application, we don't have to know how the application does what it does. As long as we know what API we need to call and what parameters we need to provide, it simplifies the use of all of those services and the data that those applications contain. When we're accessing, when we're accessing the URL, the URI of the API, it looks very similar to when you make a request on a web browser. So you've got the protocol followed by the host and then the endpoint or the resource that we're accessing. And then we can specify any parameters, generally using the question mark format, and then providing the parameter and the parameter name, and then the actual parameter. So if you use a web browser every day, that format should be very familiar to you, and it's essentially the same way we make HTTP REST API calls, and the same methods that we use when we're accessing applications on the web using a web browser to get information are the same methods that we use when we're accessing APIs as well. There's the common ones here. Obviously, when you're reading a document, you use GET. And that's very common if you're trying to request information from an API. You use a GET call, and it does the lookup on the back end and then provides your response, usually in the body of the returned packet. If we're updating or modifying something, we're going to use things like post or put or patch. If we're adding something, usually that's a post. And then if we're removing something from a data store, then we're going to use delete. The payload portion of the packet, the data portion, is sometimes utilized by APIs in order to supply additional information or to filter requests using something like a parameter. And what we can do is, if we're adding, in this case, we're doing a put, we're adding information to a database, we're going to supply the particular title and employee name of this individual, put that request out there using a post, and then that information will be added to the backend database using that API. Status codes are, again, exactly what you would see if you're using a web browser. So when we make a request, we're expecting a 200 back, which says that most likely everything went okay. Not 100% of the time, but most of the time, if we get a 200 or a 201 back, then things are good. If things went wrong on the client side, then we're going to get something in the neighborhood of 400. So if I made a request that was not what the server was expecting, I might get that 400 error. If there's an endpoint that I'm fat-fingered or it's not valid for some reason, we won't get a 404. If something is happening on the back end that's a server problem, more often than not, we're going to get a 500 series error back. And that tells you that perhaps you supplied all the information correctly, but either the server is overloaded, or you're being rate limited, or there's something else that's happening on the backside that is usually not the fault of the user. A lot of API calls use the header information from the request. to specify either something that you're looking for or the format that you're either supplying or requesting the information back in. So we talked about JSON parsing. Very, very commonly, what you'll see is that content type or accept type as JSON, so that the backend application knows that what you're supplying is in JSON format, or what you're expecting back is in JSON format. There's several applications that are out there that will accept formatting either in JSON or XML, and usually you have to use the header to specify, what the data format that you're supplying is, so that it provides the correct response. All right, I'm just going to build this one out. There are numerous ways that we can authenticate using our two APIs. We'll look at a couple of them today. One is, the very basic none, which means that you just supply the request to the web API and it returns information to you. More often than not, if you're working with a commercial application, it's going to require some sort of authentication. More frequently, we're seeing the latter ones there, token or OAuth, being required. There are some APIs that still allow you to supply a basic username and password combination in order to authenticate first, and then you can make the request after that. But more often what we're seeing is that you authenticate first, it provides you a token back, and then you take that token and then you're able to use that token in subsequent API calls. Unfortunately, the APIs that we provide, the authentication is a little bit all over the map, but I think all the ones we work with today actually are going to use that token or OAuth based authentication. All right, I'm going to build this one out again. This is a typical request and response from an API. So at the top, you can see we're making a GET request to that endpoint for people and then me. And then in the body of the response, we get back the specific information that we're looking for. And then again, more often than not, that's going to be in JSON format with most of the modern APIs that we're working with. So that exercise that we just did, where it shows you how to parse information from a JSON body, will come in handy. If we get all that information back, it's difficult to see, but it has an org ID. The data was created, first name, last name. If we only wanted to know the email address associated with that particular person that's being returned, we could use that JSON parsing to pull out that particular piece of information. All right, there's lots of ways that you can actually interact with REST APIs. I've used the office characters to kind of represent the level of sophistication, I guess, that each one requires. Curl, we use curl in the examples here. This is using a Linux command line or Windows command line now to interact with that API. Not super common. I use curl primarily when you're testing things out, make it quick, I want to see what this API returns in the format that it's expecting, or is that it will return to me. If you are going for some sort of DevNet certification, though, they use curl a lot. So understanding the flags necessary to make a command line API call are important for that application, but most developers are going to use either Postman or Python on the bottom there. OpenAPI or Swagger is it's an API interface that is usually embedded in the product itself. So you can access this Swagger interface on the same management or dashboard link for the product. You'll be able to go in there, and it's set up in a way so that you can actually make live calls after authenticating to see what a normal response is going to look like. So really easy way to kind of understand what the API structure is, what parameters it's expecting are, and give you a kind of a live interface without having to spin up a Python instance or even Postman to at least play with the API to figure out how it works and what you should expect. Postman, a lot of this course used to be based in Postman. Well, I'll show you what it looks like, but for the most part, Postman, it's a simple GUI-based application that allows you to import collections and environments that allow you to work across APIs pretty easily. It also allows you to take code or to generate an API call and then export code into a number of different formats. So super easy if you're using it to test an application or if you're building an application and you want to understand the APIs that you're working with and how to easily do that in a format that doesn't require a whole lot of coding experience. Postman's your friend. I use Postman anytime I'm writing something. Postman is up at the same time I have my Python going, so I can kind of play around with it and then move into Python the things that are important. All right. So this shows some of the examples of using curl, the command line tool. Again, there's the various flags that you would specify if you're making a command line call. I've covered all this, and I'll show you some specific examples here. This is an open API interface, right? So let me share content. All right, so here's just a couple of examples of using the various methods. So one of them, sorry for that. Paste. All right. So if I'm using curl, I can just do a simple curl and then specify the URL or the API endpoint that I'm looking for. This one is just an open API that spits out a random quote from The Office. So you can see Stanley Hudson, first name, last name, and then the quote, "Did I stutter?" So you've got, that's one example of using an API. Let's see. Let's pull up this one real quick. Oh, this should be fun. Share. Should have had these shared out already. Share application. Since REST is HTTP based, you can use a web browser. In most cases, query the API directly, and then it'll just spit out the result in the web browser itself. This is one we did when Bitcoin was taken off. So this is a query of CoinDesk looking at the current price of Bitcoin. Let's see what it is today. 26.9 in USD. So not great, but when we started these and Bitcoin was taken off, this is a little more relevant. We could see how the price would change over time. But then you can build this particular call into an application and be able to utilize this particular value in something else that you're doing. So if you want to watch to see the price of Bitcoin and when you want to make a purchase or a sale of Bitcoin, you can do that in automated fashion using the API just off of this, or using this API as part of your application. All right, and then I've got one more example here, share content and Postman. Postman, again, super easy to use. I've got a couple of locations here. You can probably tell by my background that I've got some affinity for space. So this one, we'll take a look to see where the International Space Station is at any given moment. Again, an open API call, just click send. And then this is the satellite number associated with the International Space Station. And it'll tell you the longitude and latitude and velocity of that particular satellite. There's another open API that's out there that it's called GoRest, but it allows you to do some more advanced methods rather than just gets. You can do gets and posts, so if I do get users, it'll show me all of the users that are in this particular database. And this is an open database, so anybody can put their information in here, or any kind of information. It's not limited in any way. And then I can do a create user using this post method. So I'm just going to create a new user called Creed Bratton. Let's see if that works. That did work. And so the return was, here's the ID associated with this user, his name, his email address, gender, and the status that is active. If I wanted to make a change to this database, I could use a patch method. And this time I just need to change the user ID here associated with that new user. And if I want to move Creed's account from status active to status inactive, I would just query or make a request to this endpoint, and I have now made this account inactive rather than active. So you can see that. And then if I wanted to delete that user altogether, I could issue a delete to that endpoint, and I'll delete the user. You can see nothing was returned in the body here, but I did get a 204 no content, which means, again, 200 generally means that things worked the way that we would expect them to work. All right, I'm gonna go back to the presentation, keep moving. All right, there is a slide in here for using Postman. We had previously had them use Postman. That you can omit this slide if you don't want to, or if you don't want to use it. But the one I did want to point this one out. Let me start here. Current slide. For developers that are using Postman as part of their development exercise, again, if you're working with APIs, you just want to test something out real quick to see how it works. There's a number of curated collections that are out there. Cisco's got several of them. So there's the DevNet one. There's a link for it. There's also one specific for APIs. And generally, before I get engaged in any project, what I'll do is I'll go out and look to see if the product that I'm working with has a curated collection of or Postman collection, because it just simplifies the learning to understanding how that API works. So there's examples of interacting with the various endpoints, the gets, the puts, the deletes, and or generally just the gets. But you can then take that, change the parameters, and then easily import it into your code. But there's a couple of them that are out there for, pretty much any application or any product that are either created by the manufacturer, so Cisco creates these, or they're created by, developers that had a need to build out a collection and then publish it out for everybody to use. More often than not, we're going to be using the requests library within Python to interact with APIs. Again, after you kind of do your testing and troubleshooting using Postman, ultimately you're going to want to get it into Python so you can kind of string these things together or script these things together so that they do more advanced functions. You can run, essentially a workflow within Postman by utilizing the environment variables, and there's a tests field within the API call that will allow you to take the output from one of your APIs, export it to an environment variable, and then you can use that environment variable in subsequent calls. So you can take, one and then essentially string the standalone API calls together within Postman, but it's much easier to do it in Python, in my opinion. So we're going to use requests library, so we can import requests, and then obviously after you pip install requests, then you're going to import requests, and then you're going to be able to use it. There's this deck of cards API. I'm going to take this slide out because we don't do this anymore. But then there's a new learning lab that is an introduction to REST APIs. That essentially there's a random quote API that it queries. So the user will go through that and see how to interact with the API within the Learning Lab environment. So that takes us to our hands-on exercise. I don't know how we're doing on time. Are we doing okay on time, Oksana?
Yeah, we have 10 minutes until the end of this module, so we're doing good.
Okay, good. Was there any questions about kind of the introduction to APIs section? And again, you can make this however you want. This is the way that I generally present it. I like to use kind of more hands-on examples rather than just going through the slides. I think it just kind of keeps it a little more interesting than just doing slide after slide. So
yeah, and you can just use Learning Lab 2.0 environment, right? And just spin it up and use that container to show them some of the examples. So generally, yeah, before presenting it, we recommend just to play with all examples on the slides in Python interpreter, just to feel them and maybe pick the ones that you want to show them in the interactive Python interpreter versus the slides, right? And then just do a couple of those. So, and then a couple just walking through the slides. So it's a little bit more than just boring slides all the time. And at the same time, you will be showing them how to use the lab environment as well. And when we get to the labs, we'll let them struggle for like 7-10 minutes on their own, and then we start asking them where they are and if they need any help at any point of time. Yeah, another thing to tell them, if you get stuck for more than 3 minutes, raise your hand, right? We have proctors to help you out. We don't want you to waste time. We want you to move forward with the exercises. So that's very important to repeat them all the time. Because we had people in the past, in the sessions I did, that were kept quiet, and then 10 minutes later we realized they're still on step 1 because they were troubleshooting an indentation error because of the copy and pasting error, and they just didn't tell anyone. And then eventually, right, they deviate from doing the lab to doing something else. So to avoid that, always tell them, if you get stuck for more than 2-3 minutes on an exercise, raise your hand and instructors will help you out. What else I wanted to say?
yeah, inconsistent use of spaces and tabs. Why am I getting this error?